Philosophical Papers by G.E. Moore. Quotes. Philosophical Papers by G.E. Moore is a collection of influential essays that explore various topics within the field of analytical philosophy. In this book, Moore examines fundamental issues such as the nature of sense data, the analysis of propositions, and the existence of external objects, using his meticulous style of argumentation to defend common sense against idealistic and skeptical philosophies. His essays are renowned for their clarity and rigor, and they laid the groundwork for much of 20th century analytic philosophy. Moore's discussions on the relationship between language, thought, and reality provide a significant contribution to philosophical inquiry, demonstrating his commitment to the precise analysis of ordinary language and its philosophical implications. Quote 1. Every character which characterizes either a concrete thing or a concrete individual is particular and not universal. The quote highlights the idea that specific characteristics belong to individual concrete objects rather than being shared universally. In this context, it suggests that each entity has its unique traits that cannot be generalized across multiple objects. This raises the philosophical question of whether characteristics like redness or roundness can truly apply to more than one object, or whether they are intrinsically tied to individual instances. Quote 2. Part, at least, of what he means by is particular is characterizes one thing only. This statement emphasizes the idea that the term particular refers to something that is exclusive to a single entity. The explanation revolves around the debate over whether specific attributes can be shared among multiple things, or if they are confined to one object, proposing that being particular means being unique to a single entity. Quote 3. Nothing can be a character unless it is predicable of something else. Here, the quote points out that for something to be considered a character, it must be able to describe or be attributed to another entity. This distinction plays a crucial role in separating concrete objects from their characteristics, emphasizing the dependency of characters on being applicable to something else. Quote 4. The sneeze itself is, I should say, quite clearly an event, and every event is quite as incapable of being predicated of anything else, as is a concrete thing or concrete individual or substance. This reflects Moore's disagreement with the idea that events like sneezes can be treated as characters. Instead, he argues that events are independent occurrences and cannot be applied as characteristics of other entities. By separating events from predicable characteristics, Moore seeks to clarify what qualifies as a character. Quote 5. A quality can be locally separate from itself. One and the same quality can be in two different places at the same time. The quote challenges the notion that two qualities, when described as being locally separate, must be different. Instead, it asserts that the same quality can exist in different places, which raises interesting implications for the debate about whether universal qualities can be shared by multiple entities or if they are tied to specific locations. Quote 6. There exists at present a living human body, which is my body. This quote represents one of Moore's core truisms, which he claims to know with certainty. He emphasizes the reality of his own body and its continuous existence. This serves as the foundation for his argument against philosophical skepticism by affirming that some basic truths about the world, such as the existence of one's own body, are beyond doubt. Quote 7. I am a human being, and I have, at different times since my body was born, had many different experiences, of each of many different kinds. Moore asserts his personal identity and the variety of experiences he has undergone, from perceiving objects to having dreams and emotions. This reinforces his claim that these experiences are part of the human condition and that they affirm the existence of both self and reality in opposition to skepticism. Quote 8. In the case of very many human beings who have had human bodies that were born and lived for some time upon the earth, each has frequently, during the life of his body, known a proposition corresponding to each of the propositions in I. Here, Moore points out that many human beings have had the same basic knowledge about themselves and the world as he does. This universal commonality of knowledge about the physical world further strengthens his defense of common sense, suggesting that these shared truths cannot be easily dismissed. Quote 9. Some philosophers seem to have thought it legitimate to use such expressions as, e.g., the earth has existed for many years past, as if they expressed something which they really believed, when in fact they believe that every proposition, which such an expression would ordinarily be understood to express, is, at least partially, false. Moore criticizes philosophers who claim to believe propositions like the earth has existed, but interpret them in a way that is inconsistent with common understanding. He emphasizes the importance of using language in its ordinary sense, where such statements are taken to be wholly true, to counteract skepticism. Quote 10. Such an expression as, the earth has existed for many years past, is the very type of an unambiguous expression, the meaning of which we all understand. Moore defends the clarity of certain expressions used in everyday life, such as the existence of the earth over time. He argues that these expressions are straightforward and comprehensible, opposing the idea that their meanings are complex or uncertain. This clarity serves as a basis for defending common sense against philosophical doubt. Quote 11. I am conscious now, and also I am seeing something now. This statement emphasizes two basic mental facts, being conscious and perceiving something. Moore uses this as a foundation for discussing the nature of mental facts, asserting that these are undeniable experiences which define our immediate reality. These mental facts form the groundwork for understanding both the self and external perceptions, distinguishing between different modes of consciousness, such as seeing or hearing. Quote 12. The fact that that mantelpiece is at present nearer to my body than that bookcase is. Moore points out a basic physical fact, which he considers undeniable. This serves to differentiate between physical and mental facts in his discussion. The physical fact described about the relative positions of objects stands as an example of how the physical world is structured independently of our mental states. Moore's position contrasts with idealism, which might argue that physical facts are dependent on mental facts. Quote 13. There is no good reason to suppose that every physical fact is logically dependent upon some mental fact. This quote reflects Moore's rejection of the idea that all physical facts must rely on mental ones. He argues against philosophical views, such as idealism, that posit the dependency of physical facts on mental experiences. He believes that physical facts can exist independently of human consciousness, opposing thinkers who suggest otherwise, like Berkeley. Quote 14. It seems to me that I do not directly perceive my hand, and that when I am said to perceive it, that I perceive it means that I perceive something which is representative of it, namely, a certain part of its surface. Moore explains that our perception of objects, like a hand, is indirect. Instead of perceiving the entire object directly, we perceive a representation, such as a sense datum of the hand's surface. This highlights the complexity of perception and raises questions about the nature of reality, suggesting that what we perceive is not the object itself, but a part of its representation. Quote 15. I hold that the proposition, there are and have been many selves, is quite certainly true, but that here again all the analyses of this proposition that have been suggested by philosophers are highly doubtful. Moore asserts the undeniable truth that multiple selves exist, but he expresses skepticism about philosophical attempts to analyze or explain this fact. He acknowledges the difficulty of providing a clear and certain explanation of what the self is, while remaining confident in the truth of its existence, thus illustrating his focus on common-sense knowledge over speculative philosophy. Quote 16. He would, in any case, be expressing a proposition. But if, at the moment in question, he happened to be really judging that Caesar was murdered, Then, and then only, he would, by uttering those words at that moment, be also expressing a fact. This quote introduces the distinction between propositions and facts, illustrating how one can express a proposition at any time, but it only becomes a fact if the proposition is true at that specific moment. Moore emphasizes that facts depend on reality, while propositions can exist independently of whether they correspond to a fact. Quote 17. A judgment is an event, and occurs at a time. No such fact is an event, and none occurs at a time, though each is a fact about a time. This statement emphasizes the difference between judgments and facts. Judgments are actions or events that take place in time, whereas facts are timeless truths that are about events but are not events themselves. This distinction is important for understanding the relationship between thought, reality, and truth. Quote 18. It seems to me quite plain that if Mr. Ramsay were judging now that Caesar was murdered, he must be judging, with regard to some such description, that the person who answered to it was murdered. Moore explains that judgments are not made in isolation. They involve descriptions and propositions about specific things or people. In this case, judging that Caesar was murdered involves thinking about a specific description of Caesar. This shows how judgments rely on context and refer to particular individuals or events. Quote 19. Every fact of my second class both contains at least one objective factor, and also contains at least one factor which is not merely objective. Moore defines a type of fact that includes both objective and subjective elements. Objective factors refer to elements of reality, while subjective factors involve the mental acts or judgments about those realities. This division helps clarify how facts incorporate both the external world and the mental processes involved in understanding it. Quote 20. There certainly are facts, each of which is a fact with regard to a particular individual and a particular time, such that if at the time in question the individual in question had uttered a sentence of the form, "I am judging that P," he would have expressed the fact in question. This quote highlights the temporal and personal nature of facts. A fact is tied to specific circumstances, both the individual involved and the time of the event. If the individual had expressed their judgment at that moment, they would have articulated a fact. This stresses the connection between the act of judgment and the truth of the proposition at a given moment. Quote 21. There cannot be two different facts, each of which entails the other. This principle emphasizes that two distinct facts cannot simultaneously imply one another. Moore discusses how this principle applies to propositions and judgments, suggesting that facts are not circular in their dependency. If one fact entails another, they must remain distinct to avoid logical contradictions. Quote 22. From any fact whatever in which the fact that Caesar was murdered was a factor, it would, of course, follow that Caesar was murdered. Moore argues that if the fact Caesar was murdered is present in any judgment or fact, then it must be true that Caesar was indeed murdered. This principle underlines the strict relationship between facts and reality. Facts cannot include falsehoods, and their inclusion in a judgment guarantees the truth of the proposition they represent. Quote 23. In no such case can the fact corresponding to not P be a factor in the corresponding second-class fact. This quote addresses the impossibility of a negative fact, not P, being part of a fact when the judgment involves a true proposition. Moore explains that judgments and their corresponding facts must align, and a fact that denies a true proposition cannot exist as part of a judgment that affirms it. Quote 24. I admit that it is true that PU can be properly used in such a way that it means no more than P. Moore concedes that in some contexts, saying it is true that P is no different from stating P itself. However, he introduces the idea that there are other uses where it is true that PT carries additional meaning beyond the simple proposition, involving deeper layers of correspondence or validation. This distinction reflects the nuanced ways we discuss truth. Quote 25. I do not think that these words, "is goodness a quality?" have any clear meaning. Moore begins by questioning the clarity of the phrase itself, pointing out that the question seems ambiguous. He highlights that what he intends to explore is not whether goodness is a quality in a general sense, but rather whether the specific interpretation provided by Mr. Joseph in his book holds any truth. This sets the stage for Moore's more focused examination of Joseph's claims about goodness. Quote 26. The word good is highly ambiguous. It is not only used, but correctly used, in a number of different senses. Moore emphasizes the complexity of the word good, arguing that it has multiple correct uses. This highlights the need for clarity when discussing whether goodness is a quality. By acknowledging the various ways in which good can be understood, Moore raises the issue of which specific meaning is being discussed in relation to the question of whether goodness is a quality. Quote 27. What he wants to show, then, is that no sort of intrinsic goodness is a quality. Moore pinpoints Joseph's main argument, which is that no form of intrinsic goodness can be considered a quality. This is the core of Joseph's philosophical stance, and it provides the central question for Moore's analysis. By identifying this as Joseph's objective, Moore sets up his own investigation into whether this claim is valid. Quote 28. It may be held, and I should be inclined to hold, that experience was worth having for its own sake, means precisely the same as that experience would have been worth having, even if it had existed quite alone. Moore connects the idea of intrinsic goodness to experiences that are valuable for their own sake. He suggests that experiences worth having in isolation can be considered intrinsically good. This connection between intrinsic goodness and isolated value provides a foundation for understanding how Moore views intrinsic qualities in relation to goodness. Quote 29. It seems to me quite certain that when I assert of two different experiences that they are both worth having for their own sakes, the character which I am attributing to the one is precisely the same as that which I am attributing to the other, and that hence this character cannot possibly be identical with either of the two experiences. Moore argues that the goodness attributed to experiences is the same across different experiences. This implies that goodness, as a characteristic, is not tied to a specific experience, but can be universally applied. This challenges Joseph's view that goodness is not a quality, suggesting instead that goodness can be a shared attribute among various experiences. Quote 30. No doubt what he says would have been disputed by any naive person who took Pickwick Papers for a true story. Moore acknowledges that some individuals might mistakenly believe a fictional story like Pickwick Papers to be true, including the existence of its characters. However, he points out that this belief would stem from a naive misunderstanding, as no philosopher has seriously claimed that such fictional characters are real. This clarifies the distinction between fictional and real entities in philosophical discourse. Quote 31. Mr. Ryle says that the proposition which Dickens expressed by this sentence was not about anyone and was not about Mr. Pickwick. Moore critiques Ryle's claim that propositions about fictional characters are not truly about anyone. He acknowledges that while Dickens did not refer to a real person, it is still natural to say that the proposition was about Mr. Pickwick within the context of the story. Moore suggests that Ryle's philosophical distinction, while technically correct, overlooks the common use of language, where we naturally refer to fictional characters as if they exist in their fictional world. Quote 32. Dickens was not using Mr. Pickwick as a logically proper name. Here, Moore agrees with Ryle's assertion that Dickens did not use Mr. Pickwick as a proper name in the philosophical sense. A logically proper name refers directly to an object, but since Mr. Pickwick does not exist, Dickens was not referring to a real person. Instead, Dickens was using the name in a fictional context, which creates a different kind of reference that doesn't imply the existence of a real entity. Quote 33. I am as certain that it is false as I am that when I now say Mr. Ryle is a student of Christ Church, I am not saying that only one man is called Mr. Ryle. Moore strongly rejects Ryle's implication that when we use a proper name, we are asserting that only one individual can bear that name. He argues that using the name Mr. Pickwick does not imply that only one person in the world could have been called by that name. The proposition about Mr. Pickwick does not depend on the uniqueness of the name, making Ryle's view on this point incorrect. Quote 34. Mr. Ryle seems to me here to have fallen into the extraordinarily simple-minded view that whenever we use a proper name N in a sentence, we could, without altering the meaning of the sentence, substitute for N the phrase, the only thing called N. Moore criticizes Ryle's suggestion that a proper name could be replaced with a descriptive phrase, such as the only thing called N, without changing the meaning of the sentence. He argues that this substitution misrepresents how proper names function in language. A name does not carry the implication that the person or thing named is the only one with that name, and attempting to treat it as such oversimplifies the use of names in both ordinary language and philosophy. Quote 35. Mr. Neal says that existence is not a predicate. But what does he mean by the words, existence is not a predicate? Moore begins by questioning the exact meaning behind the claim that existence is not a predicate. He explores the possibility that the word predicate could have different meanings, either logical or grammatical, and thus acknowledges the need for clarity in what is meant when someone says that existence is or isn't a predicate. This introduces the fundamental inquiry into whether existence can be considered a property of things. Quote 36. What I am not clear about is as to what is meant by saying of a particular word, that it stands for a predicate in the logical sense. Here, Moore expresses uncertainty about what it truly means to say that a word like exists functions as a predicate in the logical sense. He indicates that while we may understand how certain terms like red or growl might function as predicates, the role of exists is less clear. This statement points to Moore's broader examination of how different words operate in sentences and how they may or may not convey attributes. Quote 37. Tame tigers exist means something which cannot possibly be true unless some tame tigers do exist. Moore clarifies that for the statement tame tigers exist to be true, there must be some tame tigers in existence. This connects the concept of existence to the reality of the objects being discussed. He contrasts this with statements about behaviors, like tame tigers growl, which can be true even if only some tame tigers display that behavior, further highlighting a distinction between existence and other predicates. Quote 38. All tame tigers exist, and most tame tigers exist are utterly meaningless. Moore argues that while phrases like all tame tigers growl or most tame tigers growl make sense, the expressions all tame tigers exist or most tame tigers exist do not. This is because existence does not apply in degrees or quantities in the way that behaviors like growling do. This observation underscores the unique nature of existence as a concept, which is not comparable to typical predicates like behaviors or attributes. Quote 39. It seems to me that this exists, in this usage, always forms part of what is asserted by this is a book, this is read, etc. Moore suggests that the assertion this exists is inherently implied in statements like this is a book or this is read. When we describe something as having certain characteristics, we are also implicitly asserting its existence. This illustrates Moore's view that existence may not function as an ordinary predicate, but is still an essential part of affirming anything about an object or entity. Quote 40. It still remains a scandal to philosophy that the existence of things outside of us must be accepted merely on faith, and that, if anyone thinks good to doubt their existence, we are unable to counter his doubts by any satisfactory proof. This quote highlights Kant's concern with the inability to provide a satisfactory philosophical proof for the existence of an external world. Kant views this as a significant problem for philosophy, suggesting that the reliance on faith, rather than rigorous proof for the existence of external things, is a philosophical weakness. The importance of offering a concrete proof for the existence of objects outside of the mind is central to philosophical inquiry. Quote 41. I think it is by no means certain that Kant's proof is satisfactory. I think it is by no means certain that he did succeed in removing once for all the state of affairs which he considered to be a scandal to philosophy. More expresses doubt regarding Kant's claim to have provided a satisfactory proof of the external world's existence. He suggests that the question of whether such a proof is possible remains open and unresolved. This uncertainty leaves room for further exploration of the issue, maintaining the relevance of the philosophical debate over the existence of external objects. Quote 42. The fact is that there has been a long philosophical tradition in accordance with which the three expressions external things, things external to us, and things external to our minds have been used as equivalent to one another. Moore points out that philosophers have historically treated the terms external things, things external to us, and things external to our minds as interchangeable. This tradition assumes that these phrases all refer to objects or entities that exist independently of human perception or consciousness. By examining the historical use of these terms, Moore aims to clarify what is at stake in proving the existence of external objects. Quote 43. To say that so-and-so was at a given time to be met with in space naturally suggests that there are conditions such that anyone who fulfilled them might, conceivably, have perceived the thing in question. Moore emphasizes the idea that something to be met with in space implies the possibility of being perceived by others under the right conditions. This perception-based criterion is central to defining what constitutes an external object, as it must be something accessible to multiple observers, unlike subjective experiences like after-images or hallucinations, which are unique to individuals. Quote 44. From the fact that a thing is presented in space, it by no means follows that it is to be met with in space. Moore draws a distinction between things presented in space, such as after-images or panes, and things to be met with in space, such as physical objects. The former refers to experiences that occur in space but are subjective and cannot be perceived by others, while the latter refers to external objects that are accessible to anyone who encounters them. This distinction is crucial to understanding what qualifies as part of the external world. Quote 45. I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. How? By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left, and here is another. Moore presents a straightforward, empirical proof of the existence of external objects by simply showing his hands. This direct method of proof emphasizes his view that some things are so obvious and self-evident that they do not require complex philosophical arguments. By using the simple act of showing his hands, Moore asserts that such basic observable facts offer sufficient proof of the external world's existence. Quote 46. How absurd it would be to suggest that I did not know it, but only believed it, and that perhaps it was not the case. Moore dismisses the idea that he could merely believe but not know the existence of his hands. He argues that such skepticism about basic, observable facts is unreasonable. By highlighting the absurdity of doubting the existence of something so directly perceived, Moore defends the reliability of common-sense knowledge and challenges more extreme forms of philosophical skepticism. Quote 47. I did then, just now, give a proof that there were then external objects, and obviously, if I did, I could then have given many other proofs of the same sort that there were external objects then, and could now give many proofs of the same sort that there are external objects now. Moore affirms that his demonstration of the existence of his hands constitutes a proof of external objects. He further suggests that this method could be replicated in numerous other situations, thereby reinforcing the idea that such proofs are readily available in everyday life. This statement emphasizes the abundance of direct evidence for the existence of the external world, contrasting with philosophical doubts about such evidence. Quote 48. I can know things which I cannot prove, and among things which I certainly did know, even if, as I think, I could not prove them, were the premises of my two proofs. More acknowledges that there are certain things he knows to be true, even if he cannot provide a formal proof for them. He argues that knowledge does not always require proof, particularly in the case of basic, self-evident facts, such as the existence of his hands. This distinction between knowing and proving challenges the view that knowledge must always be supported by rigorous proof. Quote 49. I can say, I held up 2 hands above this desk not very long ago. Therefore, 2 hands existed not very long ago. Therefore, at least 2 external objects have existed at some time in the past. QED. Moore offers a proof of the existence of external objects in the past by referring to a previous act, holding up his hands. He suggests that the simple recollection of an event, when confirmed by memory, serves as sufficient evidence for the existence of external objects in the past. This shows how past experiences can provide proof of external reality, just as present experiences do. Quote 50. F. P. Ramsey, in one of his posthumously published writings, used the phrase, that paradigm of philosophy, Russell's theory of descriptions. Moore begins by highlighting how F. P. Ramsey referred to Russell's theory of descriptions as a paradigm of philosophy. This phrase captures Ramsey's deep admiration for the theory, suggesting that it represents an exemplary model of philosophical clarity and rigor. The significance lies in the impact of Russell's theory on philosophical thinking, as it became a benchmark for precise logical analysis. Quote 51. By a description we mean a phrase of the form the so-and-so, or of some equivalent form. Moore explains that Russell uses the term description to refer specifically to phrases like the so-and-so, or, more generally, to definite descriptions that identify a unique individual or object. This definition lays the groundwork for Russell's distinction between definite and indefinite descriptions, a key component of his theory. The clarity of this definition is essential to understanding how descriptions function in logical and linguistic contexts. Quote 52. All these 3 are implied by the author of Waverley was Scotch. Conversely, the 3 together, but no 2 of them, imply that the author of Waverley was Scotch. Moore illustrates one of Russell's key assertions regarding definite descriptions, that the statement, the author of Waverley was Scotch, implies 3 separate propositions. Someone wrote Waverley, only one person wrote it, and whoever wrote it was Scottish. These 3 propositions, taken together, fully define the meaning of the original statement, reflecting Russell's approach to unpacking descriptions into more basic components. Quote 53. I shall assume that for is the proposition which Russell was intending to express, improperly, as I think, by the words, whoever wrote Waverley was Scotch. Here, Moore critiques the way Russell expresses certain propositions, suggesting that his phrasing might be misleading or unclear. Moore proposes an alternative formulation, which he believes better captures Russell's intended meaning. This reflects Moore's attention to precise language, and his effort to clarify the nuances in Russell's theory. Quote 54. Russell is therefore implying that the conjunction of 1, 2, and 4 does define what is meant by the proposition in question. Moore points out that, according to Russell, the conjunction of several propositions defines the meaning of a descriptive statement. This approach aligns with Russell's logical analysis, where complex descriptions can be broken down into simpler elements. Moore's explanation shows how Russell's theory strives for greater clarity in understanding the logical structure of descriptive statements. Quote 55. But it seems to me that, in philosophy, It is often a great achievement to notice something which is perfectly obvious as soon as it is noticed, but which had not been noticed before. Moore emphasizes the significance of recognizing obvious truths that were previously overlooked. He praises Russell's ability to highlight such truths, specifically regarding propositions that are immediately clear once pointed out. This statement reflects Moore's appreciation for the simplicity and clarity that Russell's theory of descriptions brings to philosophy, showing how even the most straightforward realizations can have profound philosophical implications. Quote 56. The sentence, "The King of France is wise," means neither more nor less than that at least one person is a king of France. At most, one person is a king of France, and there is not anybody who is a king of France and is not wise. This quote represents a core element of Russell's theory, illustrating how definite descriptions work in logical terms. Instead of simply saying, "The King of France is wise," Russell's approach breaks the description down into more precise propositions that define its meaning. This method clarifies the logical structure of language, allowing for greater precision in understanding what a sentence like, "The King of France is wise," truly asserts. Quote 57. It will be useless to assert W by means of the English sentence, since nobody could possibly understand the English sentence unless he already knew what Z did mean. Moore highlights a key issue with circular definitions. They fail to provide any new information to the listener or reader. If the meaning of a term depends on understanding that same term, the explanation is redundant. This problem of circularity is important in philosophical discussions about definitions, and Moore uses it to emphasize the need for clear, non-circular explanations in logical analysis. Quote 58. If we were to assert, Z does not mean that at least one person is a king of France, we should imply that Z can be properly used to mean what? On the second occasion on which we are using it to mean. Moore points out the inherent absurdity in making certain assertions about meaning. If we claim that a phrase like Z does not mean that at least one person is a king of France, we contradict ourselves by using the same phrase to express what we deny it means. This paradox illustrates how careful philosophers must be in making claims about language and meaning. Quote 59. It seems, then, that the proposition Z does not mean that at least one person is a king of France is not self-contradictory, and therefore that the proposition Z means that at least one person is a king of France is not a tautology. Here, Moore argues that while it may seem contradictory to deny the meaning of a phrase, it is not logically self-contradictory. This leads to the conclusion that affirming the meaning of a phrase, such as Z means that at least one person is a king of France, is not a tautology. This distinction is critical for understanding the nature of propositions and avoiding oversimplification in philosophical analysis. Quote 60. It can, I think, hardly be denied that to those who understand English, the hearing or reading of D will, in general, bring before the mind ideas which the hearing or reading of T will not in general bring before the mind. Moore explains that two sentences, though logically equivalent, might evoke different ideas or concepts in the mind of the reader or listener. He suggests that while the sentences may technically mean the same thing, the number of concepts mentioned or implied by each sentence can differ, which affects how they are mentally processed. This distinction between logical equivalence and cognitive impact helps illustrate how language operates beyond mere logical form. Quote 61. But what those who use this argument often overlook is that even where we can rightly say, for this reason, that two sentences do not mean the same, it may also be perfectly right to say that, in another, and perhaps more important sense, they do mean the same. Here, Moore points out that while two sentences may not seem to mean the same thing on the surface, they can still be considered to have the same meaning in a deeper, more essential sense. This shows how language can function on multiple levels, where both distinctions and equivalences in meaning are valid, depending on the context or focus of the analysis. Quote 62. The sentence, "The sun is larger than the moon," means neither more nor less than that the moon is smaller than the sun. This quote emphasizes the logical equivalence of two statements that might appear to be different. Even though they use different wording, the sentences, "The sun is larger than the moon," and "The moon is smaller than the sun," express the same fundamental proposition. This example illustrates how different formulations can convey identical truths in logical terms, despite their superficial differences. Quote 63. I am convinced that it can and is, but I must confess that I am unable to see how it can be and why it is. Moore admits his certainty that two propositions can be the same, while also acknowledging his inability to fully explain why this is the case. This reveals his intellectual humility and the complexity of the issue, highlighting that even when philosophers are confident in a conclusion, the underlying reasons for that confidence may remain elusive or difficult to articulate. Quote 64. In the case of every sentence about which some proposition is true, the phrase of the form "the so-and-so" with which it begins cannot be defined by itself, although the sentences in which it occurs can be. Moore concludes that for certain sentences containing descriptions like "the King of France is wise," the descriptive phrase itself cannot be defined independently. However, the sentence as a whole can be clearly defined. This distinction underscores the complexity of definite descriptions and highlights one of the core insights of Russell's theory, which Moore finds particularly important. Quote 65. Each of these views consists in holding, with regard to one particular sort of thing, that no human being ever knows with complete certainty anything whatever of that sort. Moore begins by describing the four forms of skepticism he will discuss, all of which deny the possibility of knowing certain types of things with complete certainty. These views focus on different categories of knowledge, and they assert that we are unable to achieve absolute certainty in these areas. This sets up the central theme of Moore's lecture, which is to explore and challenge these skeptical positions. Quote 66. That Washington was the first president of the United States is a fact, and there is nothing strange in this use of the word fact. Moore clarifies the distinction between using the term fact to refer to objective truths, such as historical events, and other uses of the word thing, which he discusses in a different sense. He emphasizes that fact, in this context, represents a clear, indisputable truth about the world, which contrasts with the skeptical view that denies certain types of knowledge. Quote 67. I think that the common opinion that doubt is essential to skepticism arises from the mistaken opinion that if a man sincerely believes that a thing is doubtful, he must doubt it. Moore challenges the notion that doubt is a necessary component of skepticism. He argues that one can hold a skeptical view, that something is always doubtful, without personally doubting the truth of specific instances. This distinction allows for the possibility of being a skeptic about knowledge without being in a constant state of personal doubt about every specific belief. Quote 68. A man who, like Bertrand Russell, believes with the utmost confidence that he never knows for certain such a thing as that he is sitting down, may nevertheless feel perfectly sure, without a shadow of doubt, on thousands of occasions, that he is sitting down. Moore uses Russell as an example to illustrate how a person can hold a skeptical philosophical position while still feeling certain about particular experiences in everyday life. This tension between philosophical skepticism and practical certainty highlights the complexity of skeptical thought, where one can assert a lack of absolute knowledge, yet continue to operate with confidence in daily situations. Quote 69. I can't help thinking that I myself have often known for certain things of all the four kinds, with regard to which Russell declares that no human being has ever known any such thing for certain. Moore directly challenges Russell's skeptical claims by asserting that he has personally known things for certain that Russell denies anyone can know with certainty. This introduces Moore's argument against skepticism, where he defends the idea that humans do indeed possess certain knowledge in areas where skeptics claim certainty is impossible. Quote 70. It is not logically impossible that my life may be one long dream. in which I merely imagine all the objects that I believe to be external to me. Moore refers to a form of skepticism where one might doubt the reality of external objects, considering the possibility that everything experienced is part of a dream. This skepticism raises the question of whether it is possible to know with certainty that what we perceive around us is real, or if we are merely imagining these objects. This introduces the skeptical challenge to the certainty of knowledge about the external world. Quote 71. We perceive other people behaving in a manner analogous to that in which we behave, and we assume that they have had similar stimuli. Moore explains how we naturally infer that other people experience the world similarly to us based on their behavior. However, this assumption is based on analogy rather than direct knowledge. The skeptical argument points out that we can never truly know if others perceive the world in the same way we do, as we rely on external behavior to make these inferences. Quote 72. Russell did hold that I never know for certain even the general proposition that some people have had percepts, which I have not had, but like mine, or even that there have been percepts other than mine. Moore summarizes Russell's skepticism about the knowledge of other people's experiences, including the belief that no one can know for certain that others have had perceptions similar to their own. According to this view, not only is knowledge about particular perceptions uncertain, but even the general belief that other people have perceptual experiences cannot be known with certainty. Quote 73. What we know most indubitably through perception is not the movements of matter, but certain events in ourselves which are connected, in a manner not quite invariable, with the movements of matter. Moore explains Russell's idea that what we perceive most clearly and without doubt are events occurring within ourselves, not the physical objects or movements we believe we are observing. This distinction highlights the skeptical argument that our perception of external reality is indirect and always subject to doubt, even if our internal experiences seem more certain. Quote 74. In no case does any human being know for certain that is Jupiter. Moore illustrates Russell's skepticism using the example of identifying Jupiter in the sky. Russell argues that even when we believe we are observing Jupiter, we cannot be absolutely certain of this fact, as our perception could be mistaken due to external or internal factors. This claim is part of a broader skepticism that denies the possibility of knowing specific facts about the external world with certainty. Quote 75. It is not logically impossible that what did not in fact occur should be remembered, since to say that it did not occur, but nevertheless is remembered, is to be guilty of a contradiction. Moore argues that if something did not happen, it is impossible to truly remember it. To claim otherwise, that one can remember something that never occurred, would be self-contradictory. This challenges Russell's skepticism about memory, where he suggests it is possible for acts of remembrance to be about events that never took place. Moore's point is that memory, properly understood, inherently involves recalling something that genuinely happened. Quote 76. In dreams, we often remember things that never happened. At best, therefore, we can be sure of our present momentary experience, not of anything that happened even half a minute ago. Moore presents Russell's argument that because dreams can produce false memories of events that never occurred, we can never be completely certain of what we remember. Russell uses this to support his skepticism about the reliability of memory. Moore counters that this reasoning, based on the fact that we sometimes mistake dreams for memories, does not justify skepticism about all our memories. Quote 77. What he means is roughly, in dreams, we often feel as if we were remembering things which, in fact, never happened. Moore clarifies Russell's statement about memory in dreams. Rather than literally remembering things that did not happen, in dreams we only feel as though we remember them. This distinction is crucial because it separates genuine memory from the sensation of memory that occurs in dreams, which is not actual remembrance. Quote 78. The argument seems to me to be precisely on a par with the following. it is possible for a human being to be of the female sex, but I am a human being. Therefore, it is possible that I am of the female sex. Moore criticizes Russell's argument as flawed by comparing it to a faulty inference. Just because it is possible for some humans to be of the female sex, it does not follow that every individual human might be female. Similarly, Moore argues that just because some perceptions may be false, it does not follow that all perceptions are doubtful. Quote 79. I cannot help answering, it seems to me more certain that I do know that this is a pencil and that you are conscious, than that any single one of these four assumptions is true, let alone all four. Moore concludes by asserting that his knowledge of simple facts, such as recognizing a pencil or another person's consciousness, is more certain than the skeptical assumptions put forward by Russell. This highlights Moore's defense of common-sense knowledge, where he believes that basic, everyday certainties outweigh abstract philosophical skepticism. Quote 80. I am at present, as you can all see, in a room and not in the open air. I am standing up and not either sitting or lying down. I have clothes on and am not absolutely naked. Moore begins by asserting a series of simple, observable facts about his present situation, emphasizing the certainty with which he holds these truths. These basic claims demonstrate that some propositions about the external world can be known with certainty, and that denying them in ordinary circumstances would seem absurd. Moore highlights the distinction between reasonable doubt and the kind of extreme skepticism that questions even the most obvious facts. Quote 81. Suppose that now, instead of saying, I am inside a building, I were to say, I think I'm inside a building, but perhaps I'm not. It's not certain that I am. Would it not sound rather ridiculous for me now, under these circumstances, to say, I think I've got some clothes on? Here, Moore points out the absurdity of expressing doubt over facts that are immediately and clearly known. He suggests that skepticism pushed to such an extreme becomes unreasonable, especially when applied to everyday situations where certainty is both natural and necessary. This illustrates how certain knowledge claims are contextually bound, where doubt is inappropriate given the clarity of the evidence. Quote 82. All of those 7 or 8 different assertions which I made at the beginning of this lecture were alike in this respect, namely, that every one of them was an assertion, which, though it wasn't in fact false, yet might have been false. Moore acknowledges that the assertions he made are contingent, meaning they could have been false under different circumstances. However, their contingency does not undermine the fact that they are known to be true in the present moment. This distinction is key in understanding Moore's argument against skepticism. Just because something could have been false does not mean it is not certain when it is true. Quote 83. The fact that the proposition, I am standing up, is contingent does not entail the consequence that it is possible that it is false. Moore explains that just because a statement is contingent, meaning it could theoretically be false, does not imply that it is actually possible for the person making the statement to doubt its truth. He argues that in many cases, the truth of a proposition is known with certainty, even though, logically speaking, its negation is not self-contradictory. This helps to clarify the distinction between contingent truths and absolute certainty. Quote 84. I think that possibly some people might be inclined to object to what I have just said on the following ground. Surely there must be some difference between knowing and knowing with absolute certainty. Moore anticipates an objection regarding the difference between knowing something and knowing it with absolute certainty. He addresses this by suggesting that, in the relevant sense of knowing, there is no meaningful distinction. When we say we know something in everyday contexts, it often implies that we know it with absolute certainty, especially in the case of obvious observable facts. Quote 85. It is indeed obvious, I think, that a thing can't be certain unless it is known. This is one obvious point that distinguishes the use of the word certain from that of the word true. A thing that nobody knows may quite well be true, but cannot possibly be certain. Moore highlights the distinction between something being true and something being certain. A fact can be true even if no one knows it, but certainty requires knowledge. This difference is important in philosophical discussions because it shows that truth is independent of human awareness, while certainty depends on someone knowing the truth. Quote 86. Two different people who say, at the same time about the same proposition, P, the one, it is certain that P is true, the other, it is not certain that P is true, may both be saying what is true and not contradicting one another. Moore explains how two people can express seemingly contradictory statements about certainty without actually contradicting each other. This happens because certainty is relative to the person making the claim. One person may know something for certain, while the other does not, making both statements true in their respective contexts. Quote 87. Each of those 7 assertions implied the existence of something external to my mind, and that hence, if I did know any one of them to be true, when I asserted it, the existence of an external world was at that time absolutely certain. Moore argues that if his simple assertions, such as being in a room or standing up, were true, then they imply the existence of an external world. If these statements are known with certainty, then the external world's existence is also certain. This challenges philosophical skepticism about the reality of the external world by tying basic knowledge to the certainty of the external world's existence. Quote 88. If it is not certain that I am not dreaming, it is not certain that I even have the evidence of my senses that I am standing up. Moore addresses the skeptical argument that if one cannot be certain they are not dreaming, then they cannot be certain of any sensory evidence. This includes even the evidence that supports simple claims, like standing up. Moore shows how skepticism about dreaming leads to a broader doubt about the reliability of sensory experience. Quote 89. I know that I am standing up, and therefore I know that I am not dreaming. Moore counters skepticism by flipping the argument. If he knows he is standing up, then he can also know that he is not dreaming. This suggests that certain kinds of knowledge about the external world can provide a foundation for rejecting skeptical scenarios like dreaming. It emphasizes Moore's defense of common-sense knowledge against extreme skepticism. Quote 90. In my opinion, Mr. Wittgenstein is a philosophic genius of a different order from anyone else I know. This is partly owing to his great gift for seeing what is essential in a problem, and partly to his overwhelming intellectual vigor. In this quote, F.P. Ramsey praises Wittgenstein's philosophical abilities, highlighting his unique genius. Ramsey admires Wittgenstein's capacity to identify the core of complex problems and his relentless intellectual energy in pursuing solutions. This establishes Wittgenstein's exceptional status among philosophers and his significant contribution to addressing deep philosophical issues. Quote 91. Wittgenstein once told me that Ramsey had said to him, "I don't like your method of arguing." Moore recounts Wittgenstein's reflection on his discussions with Ramsey, revealing that Ramsey had expressed dissatisfaction with Wittgenstein's argumentative method. This highlights the intellectual friction between the two thinkers, even though they engaged in meaningful dialogue. It also reflects the differing philosophical approaches they brought to their conversations. Quote 92. The meaning of any single word in a language is defined, constituted, determined, or fixed by the grammatical rules with which it is used in that language. Wittgenstein emphasizes that the meaning of a word is grounded in the rules governing its use in language, not in any intrinsic property of the word itself. The grammatical framework of a language determines how a word functions and conveys meaning, which challenges the notion that words have inherent meanings outside their usage. Quote 93. But what is most important about this year, 1929, is that in it he had frequent discussions with F.P. Ramsey, discussions which were, alas, brought to an end by Ramsey's premature death in January 1930. Moore reflects on the significance of Wittgenstein's discussions with Ramsey during 1929, which contributed greatly to Wittgenstein's philosophical development. Unfortunately, these discussions were cut short due to Ramsay's early death. This statement underscores the intellectual influence Ramsay had on Wittgenstein during this critical period of his life and philosophical inquiry. Quote 94. Wittgenstein once told me that Ramsay had said to him, "I don't like your method of arguing." This quote reveals a critical moment in the intellectual relationship between Wittgenstein and Ramsay, where Ramsay expresses dissatisfaction with Wittgenstein's argumentative style. This highlights the intensity and rigor of their philosophical discussions, even though they held different views on method, emphasizing how Ramsay's constructive criticism likely impacted Wittgenstein's approach to philosophy. Quote 95. Wittgenstein always had a blackboard at both lectures and classes, and made plenty of use of it. Moore gives us a glimpse of Wittgenstein's teaching style, emphasizing his practical and interactive method. By using a blackboard extensively, Wittgenstein engaged visually with his students, making complex ideas more tangible. This detail reflects his commitment to ensuring clarity and understanding in philosophical discussions. Quote 96. He discussed it only because he thought that particular philosophical errors, or troubles in our thought, were due to false analogies suggested by our actual use of expressions. Wittgenstein's investigation into language was not because he believed language itself was the subject matter of philosophy, but because he thought misunderstandings in philosophy often arose from misleading analogies rooted in everyday language. His focus was on clearing up these misconceptions to resolve deeper philosophical problems. Quote 97. The sense of a proposition is the way in which it is verified. This quote captures a central point from Wittgenstein's earlier philosophy, where the meaning of a proposition is tied to the method of verifying it. The connection between meaning and verification plays a crucial role in how Wittgenstein understood language and logic, even though he later refined this view. Quote 98. He went on to say that the same proposition or rule which is expressed by 3 plus 3 to 6 was undoubtedly expressed in Attic Greek and in Latin by words which say nothing about the Arabic numerals 3 and 6. Wittgenstein acknowledges that mathematical rules like 3 plus 3 6 can be expressed using different symbolic systems across languages and cultures, such as Attic Greek or Latin. This implies that the symbols themselves, like Arabic numerals, are not what give the rule its meaning, but rather the underlying logical structure that the symbols represent. It highlights the universality of mathematical truths, regardless of the symbols used to express them. Quote 99. The expression 3 plus 3 tan fis, seers, sarnast 6, as used in arithmetic, always only expresses a rule of grammar, and rules of grammar treat only of the symbolism. Wittgenstein asserts that mathematical expressions like 3 plus 3 tracer 6 do not convey factual statements about the world, but are instead rules for how we use symbols within a given system of arithmetic. This view treats mathematical truths as internal to the language system, dealing only with how symbols are manipulated rather than making claims about the external world. Quote 100. The statement that rules of deduction are neither true nor false is apt to give an uncomfortable feeling. Wittgenstein addresses the discomfort many feel when told that logical rules, such as those used in arithmetic or deduction, are neither true nor false. This is because we often assume that these rules express necessary truths, but Wittgenstein's perspective challenges this assumption by suggesting that these rules are simply part of the grammatical framework of language rather than factual statements about reality. Quote 101. He said that the relation of following can be represented by tautologies, but that the tautology P to T, P eq T, PVQ does not say that PVQ follows from PQ because it says nothing, but that the fact that it is a tautology shows that PVQ follows from PPQ. Wittgenstein clarifies that tautologies in logic do not state new facts or provide meaningful information. They merely reflect the internal structure of logical systems. A tautology like PQQ PPEPPQ doesn't assert that one proposition follows from another in a substantive way, but its status as a tautology shows the inherent logical relationship between them. Quote 102. He seemed to me to be overlooking both the fact that a man often says that he is going to use an expression in a certain definite way and then does not, in fact, so use it. Moore critiques Wittgenstein's approach, suggesting that Wittgenstein may have ignored how people often declare they will use words in a certain way, but fail to follow through consistently. This inconsistency challenges Wittgenstein's broader claims about language and meaning, as it shows how the intended use of words doesn't always match their actual usage in communication. Quote 103. Wittgenstein said that the whole subject is extraordinarily difficult, because the whole field is full of misleading notations. Wittgenstein acknowledges the complexity of philosophical discussions, particularly in the context of logic and mathematics, due to the confusing or misleading notations used. He suggests that the notations themselves create problems by obscuring the clarity of the concepts being examined, making it difficult to navigate through these discussions. Quote 104. The class of things in question, if we are talking of individuals, is, he said, in this case, determined not by a proposition, but by our dictionary. It is defined by grammar. Wittgenstein emphasizes that when discussing certain concepts, such as individuals, the classification is not based on a logical or propositional structure, but rather by the rules of grammar. This reflects his view that language and grammar play a critical role in how we categorize and understand different kinds of things, particularly when these categories are not based on observable facts, but on linguistic conventions. Quote 105. He admitted that other people do have toothache, this having the meaning which we have given it. Wittgenstein concedes that while the experience of having a toothache may differ between individuals, we nonetheless use the same language to describe it. This highlights his view on language as a shared tool that allows us to communicate about personal experiences, even when the actual experience may be subjective and unverifiable by others. Quote 106. Wittgenstein compared the difference between "I have toothache" and "he has toothache" by saying that in "he has toothache," we were necessarily talking of a physical body, whereas in "I have toothache," we were not. Wittgenstein draws a distinction between first-person and third-person statements about sensations like toothache. When someone says, "I have toothache," it refers to an immediate subjective experience, not necessarily tied to the physical body. However, when someone says, "he has toothache," it is linked to the observation of another's behavior or body, suggesting an external verification process. Quote 107. In one sense, I and conscious are equivalent, but not in another. Wittgenstein suggests that in one context, the word I is closely associated with the notion of consciousness, but in another, it is used differently. This illustrates his complex understanding of the self, where I, in certain uses, refers directly to subjective consciousness, while in other cases, it may denote something more objective or detached, such as a person or body. Quote 108. Wittgenstein said that the solipsist's statement, "only my experience is real," is absurd as a statement of fact, but that the solipsist sees that a person who says, "No, my experience is real too," has not really refuted him, just as Dr. Johnson did not refute Berkeley by kicking a stone. Wittgenstein acknowledges the absurdity of the solipsist's claim that only their experience is real. However, he also highlights that a direct rebuttal of solipsism, such as asserting that another person's experience is real too, does not genuinely counter the solipsist's position. He likens this to Dr. Johnson's attempt to refute Berkeley's idealism by physically interacting with a stone, which does not address the underlying philosophical argument. Quote 109. He said that Darwin, in his expression of the emotions, made a mistake similar to Fraser's, e.g., in thinking that because our ancestors, when angry, wanted to bite, is a sufficient explanation of why we show our teeth when angry. Wittgenstein criticizes Darwin for offering an explanation of human emotional expressions based on evolutionary history, such as linking baring teeth in anger to ancestral behaviors like biting. Wittgenstein argues that such explanations, while historical, do not fully account for the contemporary significance or meaning of these expressions. This reflects Wittgenstein's broader skepticism about simple causal explanations for complex human behaviors. Quote 110. In aesthetic investigations, the one thing we are not interested in is causal connections, whereas this is the only thing we are interested in psychology. Wittgenstein contrasts aesthetic discussions with psychological ones by noting that aesthetics is concerned with understanding and describing why something is appreciated as beautiful or good, rather than uncovering the underlying causes of these perceptions. In psychology, by contrast, the focus is on identifying causal mechanisms, whereas aesthetic judgments are more about aligning something with an ideal or shared vision of beauty. Quote 111. Reasons, he said, in aesthetics are of the nature of further descriptions, e.g., you can make a person see what Brahms was driving at by showing him lots of different pieces by Brahms, or by comparing him with a contemporary author. Wittgenstein explains that in aesthetics, providing reasons is not about offering causal explanations, but about offering additional descriptions to help someone understand a work of art or music. For example, by showing multiple works by Brahms or making comparisons, one can help another person see what Brahms intended, demonstrating that aesthetic understanding is built on contextual and comparative insights. Quote 112. He said that what he was doing was a new subject, and not merely a stage in a continuous development. That there was now, in philosophy, a kink in the development of human thought, comparable to that which occurred when Galileo and his contemporaries invented dynamics. Wittgenstein positions his philosophical work as a radical break from traditional philosophy, likening it to the revolutionary changes brought about by figures like Galileo. He sees his work as introducing a new method of thinking and inquiry that marks a significant departure from past philosophical traditions, not just a continuation of earlier ideas. Philosophical Papers by G.E. Moore concludes with a reaffirmation of his belief in the necessity of clarity and precision in philosophical arguments, emphasizing the importance of common sense as a foundation for knowledge. Moore's essays collectively defend the existence of an external world, the validity of sense data, and the objectivity of moral values, challenging skepticism and idealism. His insistence on straightforward language and rigorous analysis helped shape the course of analytic philosophy, providing a counterbalance to more abstract metaphysical approaches and emphasizing the value of direct engagement with everyday experience and ordinary propositions.
Curious to dive into the mind of G.E. Moore? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of philosophical papers in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.